Sarah, tell us more about your role.
So I am the CEO of Bristol Sport Foundation, so working alongside you at the Robins and Bristol Bears Community Foundation. And our role as an organisation is probably threefold. One around delivery, so we deliver a big primary school programme about introducing children to sport and giving them positive experiences in sport. The second is around, we look after the Flyers community programme, which is about engaging children and young people in positive experience in basketball and using basketball as a vehicle to enable positive activity and giving children safe spaces to be. And then the third, and probably the most prudent to this conversation, is about how we collectively all work together. And that's around our relationships across the three foundations and how we unite here under the Bristol Sport banner to do great things across the city.
Nice.
What about you, Dan?
Right, so my role as Chief Executive of the Robins Foundation, I guess more about the Robins Foundation, so the club's official charity in terms of Bristol City Football Club. And our role effectively is to bring club and community together, and we'll do that across three strands of programmes. So education-wise, we're a college based out of here at Ashton Gate Stadium, as well as delivering in primary schools, some early intervention programmes, engaging kids in secondary schools, those who may be at risk of isolation, and all the way through up to adult education, including degree programmes and sort of everything from reading to write to the degree programmes and everything in between, if you like. Then in terms of health and wellbeing, we recognise that actually health, physical activity, mental health is really, really important. So how can we as an organisation support the local community within that? So we have a team of health and wellbeing coaches out in GP surgeries, helping those with long-term health conditions who are stuck maybe with diabetes. How can we help improve that? All the way through to some of the ageing well stuff around walking, football, Parkinson's specific sessions, dementia, using football as that tool to get people engaged in activity, which hopefully will help their conditions. And then from a youth engagement side, we look at this as a bit of a pyramid. So at the top, we're working with the five most notorious young people in terms of engagement with the police, in terms of antisocial behaviour, gangs, knife, crime, etc. With 20 hours of mentoring a week, all the way down to, at the bottom, an open access kick session for 100 kids on a Friday night free of charge for them to engage in some positive activity, and then lots of layers in between with youth councils or specific sessions around disabled kids or women and girls in terms of activity. So across all of those three areas, I think it's really important that we're providing opportunities for young people to help them excel, and that often means that we have to work with the families as well to support that overall network. So that's us as the Robins Foundation.
It's pretty comprehensive. One of the big defining factors I think about the Bristol Active City Network is around this sense of bringing the city together. You know, we've talked, and you've just talked quite comprehensively about the work that the Robins do. You know, we've reflected quite a lot around BSF about what we provide. But the critical factor in all of this is that if we are going to make a sustained systemic change to the work that we do, and not just provide a sticking plaster, but go really deep into the deep-rooted inequalities in the city, then we're going to need to think differently, and we're going to need to work differently, because actually everything that's gone before is great work and doing great things, but is it creating the shift that we need to create in order to really employ the principles of proportionate universalism and focus in on the most challenging communities across the city? And I think that's where the network has a real critical role to play to enable all of that to come together. Now that brings huge opportunity, but huge challenge, because we're talking about working differently and thinking ever so slightly differently, and almost to a point leaving our organisational hats at the door and thinking much more systemically about what we do. And that poses quite a lot of challenge and a big shift in the way that we work, but it's important to engage in that. So I think that's from a BSF perspective, and I guess a Bristol Sport perspective, of why it's important that we play quite a critical role there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it can be quite scary for organisations to come into that space with the Active City Network and go, oh wow, this is quite a big picture. So I guess the other piece to the Active City Network is for any organisations who are involved in physical activity in the city can come and join and make some connections with like-minded, I guess, organisations within the group. And from a, I guess, practical delivery level, they can go, you might bump into someone from the Bowls Club and then understand that actually how can we help support the Bowls Club in terms of their aims and objectives, and opening up the Bowls Club as a space. With the same token, it might be how can we utilise the stadium here at Ashton Gate, and how can we open up access to, like you say, a lot of the deprived communities that we're working in. So there's lots of, I guess, practical, tangible examples within the network now. Now it's been going for a year, 18 months or so, where people are able to join the group, understand what others are doing, and actually work in a more connected way. So two or three organisations aren't delivering the same thing in the same place at the same time. They're maybe working together collaboratively, spreading that across a number of days or weeks to ensure that everyone gets the maximum they can and unlocking the potential for everyone.
And I think some of it is as simple as that.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be overly complicated. Yeah, we're talking about system change and theories of change and all of that type of work, but actually just being in a room together and being able to join some of those dots yourself enables that work to really kickstart. And I think that's what's been quite refreshing about this way of working in the city, is that it is a collaborative, safe space to come and talk through some of the organisational challenges that you have, but also see the opportunities and the connectivity. And I think that, given that we all have incredibly busy roles and busy lives, that enables that work to happen at reasonable pace, which is a good thing.
I think one of the really great things about the Active City Network over the last 12 months is definitely that you're not just bringing together your traditional sports organisations. There's a real wide range of partners, including representatives from the health and wellbeing sector. You've got the ICB, you've got the local leisure centres, and it really is a focal point for getting all of those organisations together. So, for example, there's conversations around serious youth violence in the city and the impact on the healthcare system and the role that physical activity can play with sports organisations, and linking those two things together can manifest in several different ways. But now we're able to actually explore those ways rather than just thinking it from an individual lens or a single organisation. It's what are the impacts here on the hospitals, with the ICB, with the police, with the young people. So there's lots of different lenses that now it feels that we're able to start putting on these projects. Absolutely.
And I think also what's happened certainly over the last 12 months is there's also been quite a lot of intellectual investment in the way that we work. So we're talking about day-to-day delivery and how that we join those dots and that connectivity, but also about how we think and how we actually can invest in our thinking to help us give the scope and the reflection to think about how we do things differently. And that's been really quite critical, and we've had a couple of examples of that as the network has developed, both in terms of understanding how we work better together, but also the development of theory of change, and therefore how we take that as individual organisations, distill it down and say, okay, how do we contribute to that? How do we, in terms of our work, our day-to-day delivery, feed into the bigger picture, so it starts to make more sense of the city's jigsaw, I guess, and therefore where we plug those opportunities in. And that's been a really refreshing approach, certainly for me. Coming in, I'm just about to be a year in role, so that's been a really good way of working, and clearly the City Council and Westport and Sport England have invested quite significantly into that piece of work, and that's not just about unlocking cash, it's actually about building our capacity to understand so that we can go away and find the investment ourselves, which is certainly the best and more sustainable way with approaching it.
Yeah, and it's interesting in terms of the framework that's been created to allow the network to spend time with each other, build those relationships. The Clifton Strengths workshop that everyone went through, enabling us to actually understand, right, okay, well, colleagues at the council are really good at this, or individuals are really great at this, so how can we actually spend more time discussing with those people who are great at strategic thinking, or those people who are more focused on delivery, and enable times to build those relationships so we can work more effectively as a group. And I'd certainly say that I know people in the network better than I did 12 months ago. And I think there's a testament to show with the group that we've got now. This isn't just around unlocking Sport England investment. This is about how do we actually work collaboratively as a collective over the next 10 years to ensure that if there are other opportunities to bring investment into the city, that we are actually in a great place to be able to do that, and it's connected and we'll get the best bang for the buck from the investor.
To be critical from the position that we're currently in, we know that we haven't secured the big bucks from Sport England, and there's lots of reasons for that. But that's the world that we're in, and really actually once you've kind of licked your wounds from that a little bit, we are going to receive some investment, about 650 I think, maybe a little bit more, which will enable us to do some test work. And actually part of our responsibility, certainly here at Ashton Gate, is to be, because we're in a very privileged position. Whilst fundraising and attracting investment is really hard, we're also in a really privileged position here to be able to use our stamp on the city, our brands, the way we have that footprint to actually enable the network to do more. And I've certainly reflected from a foundation perspective that we should be doing that. It's not actually about us delivering more, it's actually about connecting it better, because there is some brilliant work that happens across the city, and there is no need for us to duplicate that. There is a real need for us to join it up better. And that's much more important rather than saying, actually, what, we're going to go and deliver that stuff in Knoll West, you don't need to do that. That's not the right approach. And that's when I talk, about leaving your organisational hat at the door and understanding that we're all in the room to make a difference to people's lives. We all do that differently, but it's that end game that we're trying to get to. And once you strip it back and say, actually, what, this is about the beneficiary, right? How do we do that better? Then it almost kind of starts to fall into place, because you're starting with the premise of wanting to make a difference rather than the premise of my organisation wants to make a difference. And it is an important and very critical difference that sometimes I think, just in my experience of doing quite a lot of this collaborative working, that sometimes gets missed, is that actually part of my job is to do ourselves out of a job. That's the point. So that we're not actually needed anymore. Either we've done that role in terms of connecting things up, or actually we've solved the challenges, or somebody's come along that does it better than us, and that's all good as far as I'm concerned. If you strip it back to the reason why I do this is to make a difference, then it's almost like, okay, fine, what is the next step forward that enables me to do that? And whether it's a difficult conversation, or whether it's managing a bit of funding, or all of those kinds of things, the end game remains the same, which is the good of the communities in which we work, and the privilege that we have in those communities engaging with us, rather than actually this is about my organisation doing more, growing, getting bigger, all of that kind of stuff.
The issues that we're talking about are so complex for the young people and the families that we're working with, that actually this requires systemic change. That should really be led by the government. But if we can be better connected as a network, we can sure as hell be more efficient with the way that we're working, and ultimately have a greater impact on society being connected.
Like the reason that that we were in a position where we didn't attract the levels of investment that we wanted to is because we've got, by jowl in the city, we've got some of the biggest areas of deprivation and some of the most affluent. So when you look at the participation data, the inequality here is stark, but it's not as significant as other areas of the country. And we would probably present a very powerful case to give the narrative of why it is. But the cold, hard reality of it is that we're drilling down street by street into the communities in which we work. And therefore what we're finding ourselves doing is really deep rooted, and you guys at the Robins do this much more significantly than we do, really deep rooted inequality that requires long-term investment, and the challenge that we face as organisations, and this is partly because of the political system that we have, we're in a parliamentary cycle. And we've just got a new government, which some would say is great and some would say is not. But we're now in a period of review and change, because we've had 14 years of a Conservative government and now we have a Labour government. And therefore there is going to be shift and reform in the way that we work. And as organisations, we have to kind of weather that storm while it all settles down again before we go into the next cycle. And therefore it makes any long-term strategy really challenging, because we know from the delivery that we do that actually if we're going to create this shift, this is a life's work. It's not 4 years or 10 years, it's a life's work. And that means that we have to approach it in that way, and to almost engage our funding masters and our political masters to understand that that's got to be the case if that's the shift that you want to see.
Then going back to the start, you had the Clifton Strengths workshops to help us understand where people were in terms of their strengths, weaknesses, how people could better collaborate. We then had the 2 or 3 days with Ken at Miova, supporting an understanding of system leadership, and I think that was really important to get multiple days with that group of people. And then the Matrix workshop over at Westport, again a great opportunity for us to discuss the network and some of the progress made so far, and some of the things we want to achieve, all linking into the theory of change.
And I think the critical thing that you talked about there is the element of time. So I think we all reflected, and I certainly reflected when we had the strengths workshops, that this work takes time. You need to think, you need to have time away from your organisation to reflect, both personally from an individual perspective, but also to spend time in conversation with others around how all of this knits together, what does that mean. And we've invested quite significantly into that as a network, which I think is really, really critical and really good. I think the key bit now, given that we've gone through that process, we have the theory of change, we're all wedded to that in terms of buying into it, is the what's next and the action, and how we're going to bring that to life, what we're going to do, how we're going to create a sense of almost servant leadership within the group. Because there's we're very collaborative in our approach, and we're very good at doing that. And I get a sense of, there's lots of great conversation that happens, but there does now need to be some steps as to, okay, what does that mean, and what are we physically going to do to bring that together and pull that together, and whether that's 1 or 2 projects, whether that's a piece of partnership working, whatever that looks like. There is going to be a period of who's going to stick their hand up and go, okay, do you want to do a piece of work on this? And I think that will be really critical to continue to bring this to life. We all talk about the things that we want to do, but how are we going to measure the progress? How are we going to be able to say in 6, 12, 18, 24, 36 months, this is the journey that we have been on, and this is the change that we have created. So we've got to be quite smart with that measurement, and quite driven by it, because what can happen, because this work is complex, what can happen is it kind of gets lost in the magical ether, and we've just got to make sure that we avoid that happening too much.
How would you avoid that happening too much?
How would I avoid that happening too much? I think there does need, and we talk about this in the network, around it not being driven or led by one individual organisation, and I do think that that's important. But I do think, and I just said it, that phrase servant leadership, there is going to need to be some of that, because what happens otherwise is it will become, let's meet for every 6 months, and it will naturally, and that's not a criticism, but it will naturally revert back to type, because that's what people do. So it will need an element of, right, we're focusing in on this piece of work, for example, around serious youth violence, and that might be that we start igniting a conversation across the city of, guys, what do you think? We think we're going to do a little bit of work on this. We're not quite sure how we want to do that, but instead of us doing that in isolation, we're going to do that with you and alongside you. So do you want to have a conversation about that? And that approach being a little bit of come with us, but a come with us on this is a journey that we're all going to go on, because we all know that it's a challenge for the city, and we all know it's in the One City plan, and we all know that Police Crime Commissioner has spoken about it, and we all know that this is something we need to do something about, and we know that sport and physical activity is a powerful tool to engage children, young people in their communities. So if we know all of that, what are we actually going to put in place to deliver against it? So I think it's a very subtle difference between saying we are going to do this, and therefore we are going to do this to you as organisations, we are probably going to do this is what we're thinking, come with us, let's have a chat, let's work out how we can test and learn from this, and being more inclusive with our approach is probably the way I would suggest.
It's quite challenging. What we're talking about here is quite a complex thing, quite a complex problem. So for us all, I think you've got to have a piece where there are times where everyone in the whole network is going to be involved in stuff, and there's times where 5 or 6 organisations, or 3 or 4 over here, or half of the group are over here, and we shouldn't let the fact that it has to be done in smaller groups at times get in the way of actually making progress in around some of the issues. So like Sarah said, it's about how making sure we've got regular check marks in there that are actually us delivering something. And when I say delivering, I don't mean a new session over here. I mean a wider campaign or project to enable some change within the city that makes people look or think differently. And it's difficult when you look at the theory of change. Like, it's got outputs and outcomes here, but there isn't necessarily a long-term impact. I know it talks about equity and physical activity and participation across Bristol, but what does that look like as impact for the city? Is that an increase in life expectancy for areas deprivation, or a narrowing of the inequality gap around life expectation? Is it a narrowing of the gap around education, because physical activity is known as a key driver to engage people back into education? Is it a reduction in antisocial behaviour over that period of time in those key areas that we as a network have decided to focus our energy in, because we know that actually physical activity is a great tonic to antisocial behaviour out in the community. So how are we mapping this as a collective over that 10-year, 25-year lifetime to see an evident change in some of those wider issues in the city?
But what we're talking about now is the data has told us that actually society, whilst that work was doing great things, society hasn't shifted in the way that we thought it was going to shift. So we're almost learning from where things have gone wrong, or have not necessarily done what we thought that they were going to do, and that's actually fine. There's no issue with that whatsoever. The issue comes is if we don't listen to that data and we don't apply that into our forward thinking, because then you do the same thing, you get the same outcome. You keep repeating, you're never going to break that cycle of inequality. And even if you call it something different, run a different session, have a different coach, all of that kind of stuff, yes, it contributes to the short term, but it doesn't necessarily create the societal shift that we're talking about. And that's where I think we have to get smarter around the lessening investment that we have, and be very specific, both organisationally but also as a network, to say, no, this is actually what we're focusing in on here. We're going to focus on, so for example, in the city, we know that attendance in schools is 25% lower than it is in the rest of the country, pretty much. Kids are missing out on a quarter of their year, which is unbelievable in terms of their life chances going forward. So if we say as a city, right, that is the thing that we're going to focus in on, then we focus in on that and we do it really well. There is a real danger in the work that we do of spreading ourselves way too thin, and therefore mile wide, inch deep, and not getting the level of impact that we so desire, and then almost looking back on ourselves and going, well, why didn't we make an impact? Well, because we were doing too much. And I'm very, from an organisational perspective, quite wedded to that. I think that it's really important to be really clear as to what you're going to do, but also what you're not going to do. And it's actually okay to say no to these things because this is our focus. We're all three of us actually are quite fortunate in that we're all on a strategy cycle journey. So BSF are imminently about to start their journey on strategy development, and this will form part of that conversation. So because as an organisation, we collectively recognise that actually our contribution to the city is quite important and quite vital given where we are and what we're able to unlock. So we've got a responsibility in our thinking to be looking at the theory of change and saying, okay, what does that mean to us? How can we use that? And ultimately, how are we able to demonstrate our teeny tiny contribution to enabling that to happen? So, and that's kind of what I reflected at the end of the last session that we were at, is that, okay, I see it now, I get it. Part of my job and our collective job is to take that away and go, right, what does that mean for our individual organisations? If we are truly about collaboration and we are truly committed to working together as a city, then this should be our blueprint and we feed into that. And we have a responsibility to do that because we've been fortunate enough to be involved in the process of designing it. So it should theoretically be part of who we are as organisations.
Yeah, I think what we've seen already is a sea change between a load of organisations coming together and not necessarily fully understanding what the point of us collectively working together will do, through to, right, well, we know we're going to target the areas of biggest inequality around physical activity and make genuine systemic change, and that's where the focus will be. So I think that's a really important distinction which we didn't have previously, and organisationally it aligns with what we're trying to do as an organisation, so it's a real natural fit. But I recognise there are others in the group who might work at the more elite end of sport, and actually it's not a natural conversation, but at least they can see it through that lens now and are trying to apply it. In terms of what does the future look like and how could that work in terms of keeping the momentum going, I genuinely hope that the relationship between the City Council, West Sports, as the two strategic drivers of the conversation have been so far. I hope that's added to by other organisations to help support that conversation, and the dialogue just needs to keep going, and fingers crossed we sit here in 12 months' time and there's a campaign or a project that we've all been working on, or a selection of people have been working on, to genuinely start working towards changing some of the physical environment to enable activity, or changing attitudes and culture within physical activity, or the perception of physical activity that's leading to some of the systemic change that we're after.
We've spent a year focusing in on where our strengths are, where our challenges are, and how do we now knit those together. And there is absolutely a balance in my head between individual day-to-day delivery, so sticking your hand up and going, yeah, absolutely, I can help you with that, to a more systemic, okay, we need to make sure we're on a sustained path here that we're all generally aligned to, so that we understand how and when we can contribute. And I think it's almost I sometimes describe it as a train track approach. You've kind of got, your commuter train that's going like full pelt, and then you've got your stop and start, and the stop and start is the day-to-day stuff of the opportunities of, and then your express train is almost like, right, this is the strategic direction, this is going at pace now. I mean, the biggest thing for me is pace. let's keep the momentum going so we don't stall, because there's all kinds of environmental factors that we have in our day-to-day work that could stall us. That could be a distraction almost. Things that you've got to deal with, but a distraction. Let's keep that focus and keep that express train moving so that we are in a position in 12 months' time to talk about, what is it that we've achieved, and it be really solid and really tangible. And I think that from a network reputational perspective, to maintain that buy-in is really important.